morning. A few weeks ago, we were driving down the road, and one of my kids, we passed a vacant lot. There was concrete rubble, weeds, dust, was run down, and one of my kids saw it and said, "It makes me kind of nostalgic for our home in Ishinomaki." For those, most of you would know this, some of you have come here in the last 10 years, might not know this. My name is Jonathan. I'm on staff here. My wife and I served in Ishinomaki, Japan for 5 years following the tsunami and disaster. It was earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster. It was freezing the day of the tsunami. Upwards of 20,000 people died that day. And when I see a vacant lot and rubble, nostalgia isn't really the right word. By the time we left in 2016, after 5 years of relief and recovery work, my soul was tired. I was tired of dust and sand and weeds. I was tired of run-down houses, broken homes, and broken hearts. I was tired of the constant stink of mildew and rotting fish. I was tired of being a foreigner in a strange land. Always at arm's length from the heart of the culture, my tongue shackled by a second language. Some of you know how that feels. Shaking my tiny missionary fist at an immense, indifferent ocean that had decimated a people. Tired of listening. Tired of trying to speak tiny words of hope into the hearts of deeply wounded people. That whole experience, it wasn't all bad. There were some wonderful things. Is that my alarm that's going off? All right. Somebody, your timer's up. Check the baking. There were moments of joy and beauty, of course, deep human kindness. But if you ask me what desolation looks like, I've got some idea. And so do you. Job insecurity, financial concerns, political tensions here, south of the border, or for some of you back home across the sea. Breakdowns in relationships, the inevitability of failing health and death. Your kids have made different choices than you would, or from the other direction, your parents don't understand the world that you're living in. And so you're disconnected and lonely, even in your own homes, right? Some of you have seen war firsthand. Some of you have lived in refugee camps or grown up in orphanages. I mean, some people in this room have seen those things. Somebody sitting next to you, maybe. Some of you have lived on the streets. More than a few of you have suffered some sort of abuse. And some of you have done the abusing. Many of us have lost loved ones recently. And at any minute of any day, even in the most private spaces of our lives, there is a constant torrent of fear and anxiety pouring in from every digital screen we're exposed to. The news media, whose job it is, by the way, the purpose of journalism is to warn us of danger and corruption, to draw our attention to things in society that need to be fixed. That's its job. But it is relentless. A relentless torrent of fear and anxiety. And the suffering and the hurts and the fears of our loved ones on social media isn't much less heavy, is it? So you know what desolation looks like. The prophet Isaiah gives us language for this experience. He called it the wilderness, or the desert, the wasteland, ruins. His community was tired, marked by injustice and social disparity, by civil war, internal political strife, and there were rumors that the great and rising kingdom of Assyria had taken an interest in the land of Judah. An event that God ironically would use to deal with Judah. So we get language like this. Your country is desolate, your cities burned with fire, your fields are being stripped by foreigners right before you, laid waste as when overthrown by strangers, from Isaiah 1, from Isaiah 7. In that day the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, to shave your head and private parts, and to cut off your beard also. Desolation is both comprehensive and it's intimate and shameful. So the land mourns and languishes. Lebanon is confounded and withers away. Sharon is like a desert, and Bashan and Carmel shake off their leaves. Those four places, Lebanon, Bashan, Carmel, and Sharon, were renowned for the resplendence of their agricultural goods and their forests, and they have shaken off their leaves. So Isaiah's community had some idea about desolation, about fear and anxiety. And they would learn more before the story was over. God had promised to provide for and protect them, but their worries got the better of them. And in their fear, they put their hope for salvation not in Yahweh, but in idols, in military alliances, in protectionism that resulted in injustice and neglect of those in need. And because of this, God would eventually bring his own people into the wilderness of exile in Babylon. The nations, for their part, unwitting tools of God, grew arrogant in their victories, and so God would bring them to their knees. In Isaiah 1 through 39, so Isaiah has really, you're going to think about it in two portions. Sometimes we talk about first Isaiah, which is chapters 1 through 39, and second Isaiah, chapters 4 through 55. 4 through, 66, depending on your count. First Isaiah, this all deals with the time leading up to the Babylonian exile. It happens in the 8th century. So this morning, we're going to take a bird's eye pass over first Isaiah. In Isaiah 1 through 39, everything experiences desolation. But sprinkled throughout, and then in luxuriant vision in Isaiah 35, we find that although there's a sense of impending doom, exile, desolation, does not have the last word. The last word is hope. So what is Isaiah doing? I mean, the prophet, not the book. Walter Brueggemann, in the book The Prophetic Imagination, says this: the task of the prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Let me read that again. The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Here's a simpler way to say that. We are to pay attention to different things. Go to the next slide for me there. And we are to see things differently than the world around us. To pay attention to different things and to see things differently than the world around us. King Ahaz, so that's who Isaiah is preaching to. He's appealing to Ahaz for most of this section. King Ahaz and his people and the people of Judah were terrified by the prospect of an Assyrian attack. Their hearts shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind, it tells us. And in their fear, they stopped attending to the plight of those in need. And they started looking for pragmatic ways to solve their military problems. Isaiah's prophetic task is essentially to take Ahaz by the ear, or grab him by the scruff of the neck, and force him to see the hurt of his own people that's right in front of him. And say, you cannot ignore this. And then to imagine what that wilderness could look like if they trusted in God. So he takes the king by the ear and says, look at the hurt. And then he says, imagine if the wilderness sang. I want to give you, I spent a lot of time, Billy and I and Michael have spent a lot of time in Isaiah over the last few weeks. I spent a lot of time in Isaiah this last week. And I find it helpful if you have a little bit of a structure, right? If you have a structure, then you can kind of get your head around what's going on there. So let me give you a structure for the first 39 chapters. Can you see that? You can see that. Last week, Billy, in kind of a terrifying way, took us through Isaiah 1 through 6. And then we experienced God's grace. So there's the first 5 chapters are introduction, then chapter 6, Isaiah's call. Chapters 7 through 12 are judgment and hope for Judah. So that's the main audience of Isaiah 1 through 39 is the kingdom of Judah and its kings. And then 13 to 23 is judgment and hope for the nations. 24 through 27, judgment and hope for the cosmos. Let me just mention those 3. It starts zoomed way in on a king and his people, right? Judah, for the first 7 through 12. And then it zooms out one level, right, to the nations around them. And then it zooms out again to the cosmic level. So that's a way of thinking about what's going on from 7 to 27. It starts in very zoomed in, and then it jumps out and jumps out. But it's the same pattern. It's judgment and it's hope, because there's some recurring problems that all of the people are struggling with, and that's what Isaiah is preaching to them about. In the section to Judah, God is calling Judah to return to trust in him. In the section to the nations, we're reminded that you can't just say, well, I'm a pagan, I can do what I want. There are rules in God's world, whether you're part of his people or not. You can't just do whatever you want, and there are consequences. And then the effects of our bad choices have cosmic consequences. Then Isaiah 28 to 33 kind of loops back to the first section. It's back to judgment and hope for Judah and for Ephraim, which is short form for Israel in the book of Isaiah. And then finally you get to this chapters 34 and 35, which you can sum up by saying it's a story of redemption. Because if you think about redemption, it has 2 meanings. There's a king coming who is going to defeat our captors. So there is vengeance. There is justice on its way. That's part of redemption. And then there is restoration for those of us who are captive. And that's the message of 34 and 35. Justice and restoration. And then chapters 36 through 39 is the story of Hezekiah. We're going to have a special group tell us that story in a couple weeks. I'll save the surprise for that. But does that help as a framework? So now because otherwise you look at this and it looks like just snapshots of oracles and messages and poetic things, and I don't know who's talking to who, and it just looks like a jumble. But there is a structure there. There is something that's going on that's logical, and it has a progression. This morning we're going to land in a beautiful vision of hope in Isaiah 35 in a minute. But we do need to see how we got there. Last week, the prophet Isaiah, as well as the prophet Billy, took us into the temple where the intersection of God's majesty and our sin is actually pretty terrifying. But instead of death, we found grace and calling. But the calling is hard. It takes us into a wilderness where cities lie waste without inhabitant and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate. The Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. This isn't just ancient history. This is a mirror reflecting a struggle at the core of the human experience, including ours, that when we are afraid, especially when we are afraid, Isaiah asks the question, where will you put your hope? To what will you turn? Will we trust the one who sang us into existence, who formed us from the dust and leaned in close to breathe life into us, the one Jesus teaches us to call Abba, Father? Or will we turn to other more seemingly tangible options? The prophet sees that God's people have forgotten whose they are, and that forgetfulness leads into 4 recurring sins, 4 symptoms of misplaced trust. The first is empire and bad alliances. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses but do not look to the Holy One of Israel. The second is idolatry. They will not look to the altars or the work of their hands, or have regard for the Asherah poles their fingers have made. Isaiah's really hard on the idols, and Billy's going to talk to us about that in a bit. But in short, he says, when you cut down a tree and cut it in half, and part of it you use to cook your food and the other part you worship, you're being dumb. Don't do that. Injustice. Woe to those who make unjust laws to deprive the poor of their rights, to rob the fatherless. And then especially to the nations, pride and arrogance. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will make myself like the Most High. That's something Babylon claim to. All of them grow from the same root, distrust of God and slavery to fear. When Judah was afraid, when enemies surrounded them and the economy shook, they did what most nations do. They looked for bigger friends. They made alliances with Assyria or Egypt, hoping that political power would save them. They turned to idols, visible, tangible gods that they could control. They ignored the poor and hoarded the resources to protect themselves. The nations, for their part, mistook being used by God as being gods themselves. Their sin was immense pride and arrogance. Unfortunately for us, powerful people today don't struggle with that. Our celebrities, influencers, political or economic world leaders no longer struggle with that kind of God complex, right? Whatever your political stripe. It's easy to throw global leaders and influences under the bus. But as Isaiah put it, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and yet my eyes have seen the Lord. We may not bow to Asherah poles or negotiate treaties with Pharaoh, but we make our own alliances out of fear. We hedge our bets with wealth, technology, nationalism, the illusion of control. We build our security around retirement portfolios, gated communities, or political identities. We scroll endlessly, hoping distraction will keep anxiety at bay. And when we get scared, we double down, grasping for safety instead of trusting the one who promises to be with us, Emmanuel. So maybe we also need Isaiah to take us by the ear and force us to see the hurt in our communities and imagine a more hopeful future. Isaiah's message to Judah and to us is not simply that things are bad. It's that they are misplaced hopes, that these things are bad, these things that we do. They're not just bad things, they're hope that's put in the wrong spot. Prayers which should be reserved for God alone. We're looking for salvation in things that can't save us. And that is dangerous for us, and it's offensive to God. And it leads us into the wilderness. And when we get our hopes in the wrong places, when we forget whose we are and who we are, God sometimes allows us into the wilderness as a kind of timeout so that we can think about our priorities a little bit. I've got a nephew who he kind of lives inside his own head. He's pretty content to be alone. He's a grown man now, but when he was little, he got in trouble. I don't remember what he was doing, and my sister put him in a timeout. She got busy taking care of other things. Several hours passed, and then she wondered where he was. She said, "Keenan's still sitting in the hallway?" He was. He'd spent most of the day in the timeout, perfectly happy to be in the world of his own head. That's not the way the wilderness feels, though. You don't forget you're in the wilderness. You don't forget the fear or the hurt or the desolation. And in that space, Isaiah asks us, who do we trust? For some of us, this wilderness looks like the loneliness of apartment towers or long commutes, where we see hundreds of faces and know none of them. For others, it's the ache of displacement, far from being home, navigating new systems, new languages. For others, still, it's the weariness of working hard and falling behind, or in the quiet despair of growing old while the world seems to move on without us. The wilderness can be an empty downtown, a nursing home hallway, or a refugee waiting room. It can be the silence after a broken relationship, or the numbness that comes from trying not to care anymore. But, and here's the grace, the wilderness is not just punishment. It's not just consequences for ours or somebody else's bad decisions. It can be God's classroom for trust and transformation. It is the burning coal from the altar on our lips. As Isaiah's prophecies unfold, the wilderness becomes the central stage of God's redemption. Chapters 33 and 34 describe judgment and devastation. The land laid waste, the nations brought low. Edom, now representing the arrogance of all the nations, the empires, exalts itself against God. It's a grim picture. The sky dissolves, streams turn to pitch, thorns and briars take over what was once fruitful. But just when we think the story is over, chapter 35 bursts in like spring after a long winter. Let me invite you to close your eyes and let Isaiah's vision bring light where there was darkness, life where there was death, hope where there was despair. Let me read Isaiah chapter 35 to you. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. So strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, don't be afraid. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come and save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling streams. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And a highway will be there, and it will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on the way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed who walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. That is a rich vision in the midst of desolation. Not escape from the desert, but the desert itself waking up and transforming into a garden and rejoicing. Joy overtakes us, sighing and sorrow flee away. It's not sentimental either. God's vengeance is not about payback. It's about setting things right. It's about divine justice that restores sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, strength to the lame, and joy to the mute. Water gushes in the desert. Burning sand becomes pools. Jackals are replaced by reeds and papyrus. Isaiah sees a world where God takes the very places of desolation and turns them into gardens of joy. And then he sees something more. A highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. Who are we? We are people of the way. Jesus called himself the way, the truth, and the light. The redeemed will walk there. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Sorrow and sighing will flee away. This is more than poetry. It is prophetic imagination, a holy revisioning of reality. Remember Brueggemann, the quote? The task of prophetic ministry to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the dominant culture, to pay attention to the hurt around us, to what's really going on, and then to see things as they could be. Isaiah refuses to accept the numbness of despair. He refuses to manage decline like a bureaucrat. Instead, he dares to imagine that God is not done, that the wilderness itself can bloom. Isaiah's call to Judah is the same call to us. In your fear, get your hope in the right spot. We can name our modern idols: the power of money to buy safety, the comfort of consumerism to numb anxiety, the myth of self-sufficiency that we say can fix ourselves if we just try harder, the political idols that promise salvation if only our side wins, the subtle arrogance that assumes we can manage our lives without God's grace or will. When our fear outweighs our faith, we turn to higher powers, whether gods or governments, stock markets or smartphones, and God's question still echoes, will you trust me? Isaiah invites us to see the wilderness parts of our world as he saw his, as both judgment and invitation, a mirror of our failure of trust and a canvas for God's new creation. So what might it look like for the wilderness to bloom here in our city? Maybe it looks like refugees belonging and neighbors learning each other's names. Maybe it looks like older saints mentoring the young. Maybe it looks like a shared meal that crosses cultures and languages and economic divides. Maybe it looks like affordable housing where there was once an empty lot. Maybe it looks like volunteers sitting quietly with the lonely, or artists painting murals of hope on blank concrete walls. In every act of compassion, in every risk of reconciliation, in every small beauty we plant in the dust, the wilderness begins to sing. Which brings me back to Japan. You can go to the next one and sit on that one. So there you go. Skinny guy. When we lived in Ishinomaki, we met this couple, the Aoyagis, Mr. and Mrs. Aoyagi. I don't even know what church they were from. I don't even know what denomination. They reminded me of Priscilla and Aquila. They were a couple who saw the hurt, stepped into it, quietly made space for beauty and restoration. They were retired and comfortable in their retirement before the tsunami. They were wealthy. But after the desire, instead of retreating into safety, they began traveling through the broken towns, visiting residents and relief workers alike. They were encouragers in the midst of the desolation. They weren't physically all that strong, and although they were wealthy, their wealth wouldn't have made much of a dent in the most expensive disaster in human history. But they sat down with us and with our neighbors and had tea, and they listened and they prayed. And they supplied tulip bulbs. Thousands and thousands and thousands of tulip bulbs. Like Isaiah in the midst of the dust and sand and rubble and despair, they could see something else. They could see a springtime when the gray landscape would burst into color. It was such a small thing, such a small thing. But it was them fulfilling the prophetic task. They really saw the hurt, but they also saw and kindled the imagination of those around them. They saw what could be. The wilderness and desolation are part of our story, but they are not the end of the story. Hope has the last word. I think, let's stay on that one. The empty promises of the no gods will not have the last word. The might of empire will not have the last word. Injustice, exploitation, and neglect will not have the last word. The arrogance of the powerful will not have the last word. Fear will not have the last word. The last word belongs to God, to life, to compassion, to joy. Isaiah's invitation is not simply for ancient kings to smarten up or for us to feel comforted in hard times. It is a call to become participants in God's reimagining of the world. It's a call to become a prophetic community, to be little Isaiahs, you and me, who see the devastation and the hurt and the loneliness and the fear around us and dare to believe that that wilderness too can bloom. To sit with the brokenhearted, to plant tulips in the dust, to nurture imagination in a culture of fear. So here's the invitation. In the dust of despair, can we see where the flowers might bloom? In the dry places of our city and our own lives, can we hear the sound of running water in the desert? Is there one small, beautiful thing that you could do this week to turn lament into praise, sorrow into hope, despair into hope, or sorrow into joy? The wilderness and the parched land will be glad. The desert will rejoice and blossom like a crocus. So strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong. Don't be afraid. Your God will come and save you. The redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will run away. May we be that people. May our wilderness bloom. And may the final word be not fear or desolation, but hope.